The curse of Tutankhamun, what really happened after the tomb was opened. The sound of desert wind whispers through the darkness. Slowly, a golden sunrise breaks over endless cliffs. The Valley of the Kings emerges from shadow, silent and untouched. Ancient mountains glow beneath the Egyptian dawn. A lone raven circles overhead. The music is low, mysterious, and haunting. For more than 3,000 years, the desert kept a secret. Hidden beneath these barren cliffs lay the resting place of kings who believed death was not an ending, but the beginning of eternity. They filled their tombs with gold. They surrounded themselves with sacred texts. They carried weapons they would never use, food they would never eat, jewels that no living eye would see again. Every object had a purpose. Every chamber had a meaning. Every wall was covered with prayers, meant to guide a soul beyond death. But above all else, these kings wanted only one thing: to remain undisturbed forever. Because, to the ancient Egyptians, to disturb the dead was not merely theft. It was an attack on eternity itself. The camera glides deeper into the Valley of the Kings. Towering limestone cliffs cast long shadows across the desert floor. No trees, no rivers, only silence. A silence so complete that even the wind seems careful not to break it. For centuries, travelers crossed this valley without realizing what rested beneath their feet. Hidden passages, sealed doorways, forgotten chambers, entire worlds buried beneath layers of stone and sand. Some tombs had already been discovered. Many had been robbed long ago. Others vanished from history completely, their owners forgotten, their names erased, until only the desert remembered. Then, in the early 20th century, one man refused to believe the valley had surrendered all its secrets. His name, Howard Carter, Egypt, 1907. Cairo was alive with explorers. The world had become fascinated with ancient Egypt. Museums competed to acquire priceless artifacts. Collectors paid fortunes for statues, jewelry, and mummies. European newspapers eagerly reported every archaeological discovery. The ancient world was becoming modern entertainment. Yet despite decades of excavations, one mystery remained. Many believed a royal tomb was still missing. The tomb of a little-known pharaoh, Tutankhamun. Few people had heard his name, unlike Ramses the Great, or Hatshepsut, or Akhenaten. Tutankhamun seemed almost invisible in history. His reign had been brief. His monuments were small. Even ancient records barely mentioned him. Some scholars wondered if his tomb had ever existed at all. Others believed grave robbers had destroyed it centuries earlier. Most archaeologists had already given up searching, but one man had not. Howard Carter believed the valley still had one final secret waiting beneath the sand. Howard Carter was unlike many explorers of his time. He was not born into wealth. He was not trained at a prestigious university. Instead, he began his career as an artist. As a young man, Carter traveled to Egypt to copy ancient wall paintings with remarkable precision. His sharp eye for detail earned the respect of archaeologists, and over time he transformed from an illustrator into one of the world's most determined excavators. While others chased fame, Carter chased evidence. He believed archaeology was not about treasure, it was about understanding the people who came before us. That belief would define his life's work. Yet, years passed with little success. Dig after dig revealed fragments, broken pottery, and empty tombs. Many thought the Valley of the Kings had nothing left to offer, but Carter disagreed. Somewhere beneath the desert, he believed, a forgotten king was still waiting. Number. Chapter 2. Number. The boy king nobody remembered. Tutankhamun was once one of the most important people in Egypt. He was a king, a living god in the eyes of his people, the ruler of a civilization that had already existed for thousands of years. And yet, when the modern world finally began searching for his tomb, almost nobody remembered him. His name had nearly disappeared. His monuments had been dismantled. His memory had been pushed aside. And for centuries, Tutankhamun remained little more than a forgotten name buried somewhere beneath the sands of Egypt. The strange thing is that Tutankhamun was never supposed to become famous. He did not build the largest pyramid. He did not lead great armies across foreign lands. He did not rule Egypt for decades. He did not leave behind enormous monuments announcing his greatness. He was a young king who inherited a kingdom already struggling with the consequences of one of the most dramatic religious revolutions in ancient history. And perhaps the greatest mystery surrounding him is not how his tomb was discovered. It is how he became forgotten in the first place. To understand the story of Tutankhamun, we have to go back before the Golden Mask, before the Valley of the Kings, and before the word curse became associated with his name. We have to return to a time when Egypt itself was changing. More than 3,000 years ago, Egypt was ruled by powerful pharaohs who were believed to stand between the human world and the divine. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was part of a sacred system that connected the people, the gods, the land, and the afterlife. For generations, Egyptian rulers had built temples, monuments, and tombs, designed to preserve their names for eternity. The ancient Egyptians believed that a person's existence continued after death, but that eternal existence depended upon memory. The body needed protection, the name needed to survive, the soul needed a place to return to, and the offerings, prayers, and rituals performed by the living helped sustain the dead. To be remembered was to continue existing. To have your name erased was something much more frightening. It threatened the possibility of eternity itself. This belief would become especially important in the story of Tutankhamun, because decades before his tomb was opened, another Egyptian king had attempted to transform the religious world completely. His name was Akhenaten, and his revolution would create the strange circumstances into which Tutankhamun was born. Akhenaten had begun his reign under a different name. He was originally known as Amenhotep IV. He belonged to the 18th dynasty, one of the most powerful periods in ancient Egyptian history. Egypt was wealthy. Its armies were powerful. Its temples were magnificent. Its traditional gods had been worshipped for generations. Among them was Amun, one of the most powerful gods in the Egyptian religious system. But Amenhotep IV began moving Egypt in a radically different direction. He elevated the Aten, represented by the sun disk, above the traditional religious establishment. Eventually, he changed his own name to Akhenaten, and then he did something extraordinary. He abandoned the traditional capital of Thebes and established a new city dedicated to the Aten. The city became known as Akhetaten. Today, its ruins are associated with the site of Amarna. Akhenaten's new religious order challenged centuries of Egyptian tradition. Temples associated with the old gods lost influence. The names of traditional deities were removed from monuments. The royal court moved away from the old centers of power, and the artistic style of the period changed dramatically. Royal figures were portrayed in ways that looked very different from earlier Egyptian art. Akhenaten appeared with his family beneath the rays of the Aten. The king and queen were shown in intimate family scenes. The old visual language of Egyptian royalty was being transformed, but revolutions rarely disappear without consequences. When a ruler attempts to change religion, politics, tradition, and the location of power all at once, resistance is almost inevitable. Akhenaten's experiment did not last forever, and somewhere within this turbulent royal family was a young boy who would eventually inherit the throne. His name was Tutankhamun. At birth, he was connected to the Aten. Even his name reflected the religious world created by Akhenaten. But history would soon change his identity. The exact details of Tutankhamun's early childhood remain uncertain. Ancient evidence is incomplete. Modern researchers have attempted to reconstruct his family through inscriptions, archaeology, genetic studies, and the remains discovered in royal tombs. But there are still unanswered questions. Who exactly was his mother? What was the precise relationship between the young prince and the other members of the Amarna royal family? How much did he understand about the religious conflict surrounding his family? We know that he was born into extraordinary circumstances. He was not simply a child growing up in a royal palace. He was growing up inside a revolution. And before he was old enough to understand the political world around him, that revolution began to collapse. Akhenaten died. The new religious order weakened. The old religious establishment returned. The royal court moved away from Akhenaten, and the young Tutankhamun became king. He was still a child. He could not have understood the enormous responsibilities that had suddenly been placed upon him. But in ancient Egypt, the identity of the king mattered enormously. The country needed stability. The religious order needed restoration. The traditional temples needed to be reopened. The relationship between the royal government and the priesthood needed to be repaired. And so the young king's reign became part of a larger effort to reverse the changes introduced by Akhenaten. Tutankhamun became Tutankhamun. The change was more than a change of name. It represented a political and religious transformation. The name Tutankhamun connected the king with Amun, the powerful god whose worship had been disrupted during Akhenaten's reign. The traditional religious order was being restored. The old gods were returning. The temples were being repaired, and the young king became the symbol of Egypt's return to tradition. But Tutankhamun himself was still only a child. The decisions of his reign were almost certainly shaped by experienced officials and advisors around him. Among the important figures of this period was an influential court official who would later become pharaoh himself. Another important figure was Horemheb, a powerful military commander who would eventually also become king. Tutankhamun was therefore surrounded by adults with political experience, ambitions, and interests of their own. The young king occupied the center of the political system, but the people around him helped determine its direction. For several years, Egypt continued to recover from the upheaval of the Amarna period. Tutankhamun's reign lasted roughly a decade. In the scale of Egyptian history, that was not long. He did not have enough time to establish himself as one of Egypt's greatest rulers. He did not leave behind the monumental legacy of kings who ruled for generations. And then, unexpectedly, he died. He was probably still a teenager or a young man. His exact age at death remains a subject of scientific discussion, but there is no doubt that he was young. The death of a young king creates a problem. There is no long established succession, no adult heir ready to continue the dynasty, no certainty about what comes next. And in ancient Egypt, the death of a pharaoh was not merely a private tragedy, it was a national event. The king was central to the religious and political order. His death required elaborate rituals. His body had to be prepared. His burial had to be completed. His journey into the afterlife had to be secured. The royal succession had to be resolved. Tutankhamun was buried in the Valley of the Kings. But his tomb was unusual. Very unusual. The tomb that would eventually become known as KV-62 was not one of the enormous royal tombs we might expect for a pharaoh. Its layout is comparatively small. Its design appears different from the grand royal tombs associated with other rulers. There are several theories about why. Perhaps Tutankhamun died unexpectedly. Perhaps his burial had to be prepared quickly. Perhaps an existing tomb was adapted for him. Perhaps parts of the tomb had been intended for someone else. Archaeologists continue to study the evidence. But whatever the reason, Tutankhamun's burial place was not designed to become the greatest tomb in Egyptian history. It was designed to serve one purpose: to bury a young king, to protect his body, to preserve his possessions, and to allow him to enter the afterlife, according to Egyptian belief. The people who prepared the burial could never have imagined what would happen thousands of years later. They could not have known that archaeologists would one day stand outside the entrance. They could not have known that newspapers around the world would publish photographs of their work. They could not have known that millions of people would become fascinated by the young king. And they certainly could not have known that a legend of a supernatural curse would eventually be attached to his name. For the people of ancient Egypt, the burial was not a horror story. It was a sacred responsibility. The tomb was meant to protect the dead. The objects placed inside were not simply treasures. They were part of the king's preparation for eternity. Food, furniture, weapons, clothing, jewelry, chariots, statues, ceremonial objects. Everything had meaning. Some objects represented the king's status. Others were intended to serve him in the afterlife. The golden mask, that would eventually become one of the most recognizable objects in the world, was not created for tourists. It was created for a burial. Its purpose was to identify and protect the king. The craftsmen who made it were participating in a religious tradition that stretched back thousands of years. And when the tomb was finally sealed, the world above moved on. The ancient Egyptians continued living. Generations passed. Dynasties rose and fell. Wars changed borders. Foreign rulers conquered Egypt. Persian armies arrived. Alexander the Great conquered the country. Greek rulers governed Egypt. Rome eventually took control. Centuries became millennia, and Tutankhamun's name slowly disappeared from common memory. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of his story. His tomb was not always famous. His name was not always associated with mystery. He was not always the boy king. For most of history, almost nobody knew who he was. The Valley of the Kings itself changed. Tombs were robbed. Others were buried beneath debris. Floods carried sediment through the valley. Workers excavating later tombs dumped rubble across the landscape. The entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb became hidden. Perhaps that accidental protection was the reason it survived. If the tomb had been located in a more obvious place, it might have been completely stripped during antiquity. Instead, debris accumulated above it. Other workers unknowingly built over parts of the area. The entrance disappeared. The desert covered the evidence, and the young king waited. Centuries became thousands of years. The world forgot him, but Egypt did not completely forget the royal family of the Amarna period. Archaeologists began rediscovering pieces of the story in the 19th century. Ancient inscriptions were studied. Ruins were mapped. Royal tombs were excavated. Museums filled with Egyptian artifacts. European scholars became increasingly fascinated with the civilization of the Nile, and gradually, archaeologists began reconstructing the history of Egypt's forgotten rulers. Tutankhamun's name began appearing again, but only faintly. There was no great monument bearing his name, no intact temple announcing his victories, no enormous pyramid marking his place in history. He was almost invisible. Then came the 20th century. Archaeology became more systematic. Excavators began searching the Valley of the Kings with greater determination. Among them was Howard Carter. Carter had spent years studying the valley. He knew its geography. He knew where earlier excavations had taken place. He understood where debris had accumulated, and he believed that something was still missing. Tutankhamun. A king had ruled Egypt. A king had died. A king had been buried. But where was the tomb? Carter became convinced that the answer was somewhere beneath the valley floor. His belief was not based on magic. It was based on evidence. Fragments of objects bearing Tutankhamun's name had been found. The existence of the king was known, but his tomb had not been identified. If the tomb had survived, it might still be hidden. For Carter, that possibility became an obsession, and eventually his work brought him into partnership with Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon provided the financial support necessary for excavation. Together, they searched the Valley of the Kings. One season followed another. They found evidence of ancient activity. They found tombs. They found objects. But the tomb of Tutankhamun remained elusive. Eventually, Carnarvon began to lose patience. The excavation was expensive. The valley seemed exhausted. The possibility of discovering an intact royal tomb appeared increasingly unlikely. For many archaeologists, the logical decision would have been to stop. But Carter believed there was one area they had not properly investigated. A small section of ground near the tomb of Ramesses VI. It did not look promising. It was covered with debris. Other excavations had taken place nearby. But Carter had studied the evidence. He believed that the tomb of Tutankhamun might still be there. He convinced Carnarvon to give him one final season, one last attempt, one last opportunity. And so, in 1922, workers returned to the Valley of the Kings. They cleared the ground. They moved the debris. They dug deeper. For several days, nothing happened. Then, on November 4, a worker made a discovery, a step, an ancient stone step hidden beneath the desert. Carter was called. He looked down. Then another step was uncovered, and another. The staircase continued downward. Carter realized that they had found something significant. The workers continued clearing. The staircase descended toward a doorway. The entrance was sealed. The possibility that Carter had been searching for all those years suddenly became real. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps beneath the desert was the tomb of the forgotten boy king. Carter ordered the work stopped. He wanted to preserve the discovery. He needed to contact Carnarvon. A message was sent. Lord Carnarvon immediately prepared to return to Egypt. For Howard Carter, the waiting must have been unbearable. He had spent years searching for this moment. Now he stood before a sealed doorway that had remained untouched for more than 3,000 years. What was behind it? An empty tomb? A burial robbed long ago? Or the greatest archaeological discovery of the century? Nobody knew. The desert remained silent. The ancient doorway remained sealed. And somewhere beyond it, Tutankhamun was waiting. Not as a legend, not as a curse. Not as the terrifying mummy king imagined by later generations, but as a young Egyptian ruler whose life had ended thousands of years earlier. A forgotten king, a boy whose reign had been short, a pharaoh whose name had nearly vanished from history. And now his tomb was about to be opened. What happened next would transform Tutankhamun from one of Egypt's forgotten king into the most famous pharaoh the modern world had ever known. But it would also create another story, a story involving death, a story involving newspapers, a story involving fear, and eventually a story about a curse. The tomb had been silent for more than 3,000 years. Soon, the world would hear its voice. Number, Chapter 3. Number, The Last Chance. For Howard Carter, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb did not begin with a staircase. It began with doubt. For years, Carter had walked through the Valley of the Kings, searching for a king whose tomb seemed to have vanished from history. The valley had already surrendered many of its secrets. Tomb after tomb had been discovered. Some contained magnificent treasures. Others had been robbed in antiquity and left almost empty. Some belonged to powerful pharaohs whose names were still remembered thousands of years later. But Tutankhamun was different. He had ruled Egypt. He had been buried as a king. His name appeared on ancient objects, yet his tomb had never been conclusively identified. It was as if the young pharaoh had disappeared. Howard Carter believed that he had not disappeared at all. He believed he was still there, somewhere beneath the desert, waiting. The Valley of the Kings was not an easy place to search. Its landscape was deceptive. The cliffs were steep and barren. The ground was covered by layers of stone and debris, accumulated over centuries. Every excavation changed the landscape. When ancient workers cut into the valley, they removed enormous quantities of rock and soil. When later tombs were constructed, their excavated material was often dumped nearby. Floods occasionally carried stones and sediment through the valley. Over generations, one excavation could hide another. A tomb entrance could disappear beneath debris without anyone realizing what had happened. This was especially important for Carter. He did not believe that the absence of a visible entrance meant the absence of a tomb. The evidence had to be reconstructed. The valley had to be treated like a puzzle, and Carter believed some pieces were still missing. Tutankhamun's name had appeared on objects discovered elsewhere. His reign was known. His burial was known from historical evidence. But the location of his final resting place remained uncertain. That meant the tomb had to exist somewhere. The question was, where? Carter had already spent years working in Egypt. He had learned to observe details that others might overlook. He understood the landscape. He understood how earlier excavations had changed it. He knew which areas had been searched and which had not. And slowly, one possibility began to occupy his thoughts. Perhaps the tomb was in an area that other excavators had already dismissed. Near the tomb of Ramesses VI was a small area that had not received the attention Carter believed it deserved. It did not look promising. The ground was cluttered with debris. The entrance to another royal tomb was nearby. Earlier workers had passed through the area. To many archaeologists, it seemed unlikely that an important undiscovered tomb could still be hiding there. But Carter saw things differently. Perhaps the very activity that made the area look unimportant had concealed the entrance. Perhaps an ancient tomb had been covered by centuries of accumulated debris. Perhaps Tutankhamun's tomb was closer than anyone imagined. There was only one way to find out. They had to dig, but excavation required money. And money was running out. Lord Carnarvon had supported Carter's work for years. Carnarvon was a wealthy English aristocrat who had developed a deep interest in Egypt. His financial support had allowed Carter to continue excavating when many other archaeologists might have stopped. But archaeology was expensive. Workers had to be employed. Equipment had to be purchased. Transportation had to be arranged. The excavation site had to be maintained. And after years of searching, Carnarvon had every reason to question whether another season was worth the expense. The valley had already produced many discoveries. What if there was nothing left? What if Tutankhamun's tomb had been destroyed? What if it had been robbed? What if Carter's theory was simply wrong? Eventually, Carnarvon decided that the excavation could not continue indefinitely. For Carter, this was devastating. He was not ready to give up. He believed there was still a possibility. One final possibility. He asked Carnarvon for another season. One last attempt. It was a gamble. If they found nothing, the search would likely end. Carter would have to accept that Tutankhamun might remain hidden forever. But if he was right, everything could change. The agreement was made. Carter would return to the valley. He would concentrate on the area he believed had been overlooked. And in the autumn of 1922, the excavation began again. The Valley of the Kings was quiet. The great crowds that would eventually descend upon the site did not yet exist. There were no television cameras, no international press corps, no tourists standing behind barriers. There was simply Carter, his workers, the desert, and an unanswered question. Where was Tutankhamun? Day after day, the workers cleared the ground. Stone was moved. Sand was removed. Debris was carried away. The work was slow. It was physical. And for those watching from outside, it must have seemed almost uneventful. There were no dramatic discoveries, no golden statues, no spectacular artifacts, only dirt and rock. Then, on the 4th of November, 1922, something changed. A worker uncovered a stone step. At first, it may not have looked extraordinary. Ancient stone was everywhere, in the Valley of the Kings. But this was different. The position of the step suggested that it belonged to something beneath the ground. Carter was called to examine it. He looked at the discovery. Then the workers continued. Another step appeared. Then another. Slowly, a staircase began to emerge from beneath the desert. The possibility was becoming impossible to ignore. There was something below, something deliberately constructed, something ancient. Carter must have felt the tension building. For years, he had imagined this moment. But imagination was one thing, reality was another. The staircase continued downward. The workers carefully removed the accumulated debris. The entrance became clearer. At the bottom of the staircase was a doorway. It was sealed. The discovery had become serious. Carter did not know yet exactly what he had found. It could have been an insignificant tomb. It could have been an unfinished burial. It could have been a tomb that had already been robbed. But the sealed entrance suggested that something had survived. And then Carter noticed something even more important. The evidence on the doorway appeared connected to a royal burial. The possibility was extraordinary. Could this be Tutankhamun, the forgotten king, the pharaoh Carter had spent years searching for? He could not know. Not yet. The excavation had reached the moment when patience mattered more than excitement. Carter ordered the work to stop. He needed to protect the discovery. He needed Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon was in England, thousands of kilometers away. Carter sent him a telegram, informing him of the discovery. The message was short, but behind those few words was the culmination of years of searching. Carnarvon immediately prepared to travel to Egypt. Until his arrival, Carter guarded the site. The staircase remained hidden. The doorway remained closed. The desert continued to blow across the valley, and for a few days, the secret remained between the archaeologist, his workers, and the ancient stones. Carnarvon eventually arrived. Now the two men stood together before the entrance. Whatever was behind it would soon be revealed. The staircase was cleared. The passage was examined, and another sealed doorway appeared. This was no longer a simple possibility. There was a tomb. The question was whose? Carter studied the ancient seals. He searched for the name. He looked carefully at the markings. The evidence began to point toward Tutankhamun. The forgotten king was no longer simply a name in historical records. His burial place might be directly in front of them. But Carter still needed to proceed carefully. He knew that opening the tomb could destroy evidence if it was done carelessly. The ancient Egyptians had sealed the entrance thousands of years earlier. The material around the doorway could tell archaeologists how the tomb had been used. It could reveal whether robbers had entered. It could reveal whether the burial had been disturbed. Every detail mattered. Carter and Carnarvon were not standing before a treasure chest. They were standing before an archaeological record, a record that had survived more than 3,000 years. Then came the moment. Carter made a small opening in the sealed doorway. The opening was just large enough for him to look inside. Beyond it was darkness, complete darkness. He waited. Then he took a candle. He raised it toward the opening. The flame disappeared into the darkness. Carter looked inside. At first, he saw nothing clearly. Then the light began to reveal shapes. Gold, objects, furniture, statues, strange forms emerging from the shadows. The chamber appeared filled with possessions. Carter stared. Behind him stood Carnarvon. The moment was almost impossible to comprehend. The tomb had survived, and it was not empty. Carnarvon asked the question that would become famous. "Can you see anything?" Carter answered, "Yes, wonderful things." Those words would become permanently associated with the discovery. But what Carter saw through that small opening was only the beginning. The chamber was packed with objects. Some were covered in gold. Some were made of wood. Others were decorated with intricate designs. There were statues, chariots, boxes, furniture, weapons, ceremonial objects. The sheer quantity was astonishing. For centuries, the public imagination had associated ancient Egyptian tombs with treasure. But most royal tombs discovered before this had been disturbed by ancient robbers. Their contents had been scattered or removed. Here, the situation was different. Tutankhamun's tomb had been entered at some point in antiquity. Evidence suggested that ancient robbers had breached the tomb, but the burial had survived. Much of the extraordinary collection remained. The chamber was a time capsule, a window into a civilization that had disappeared thousands of years earlier. And at the center of this discovery was a king almost nobody in the modern world had remembered, Tutankhamun. The news would not remain confined to Egypt. It would soon travel across the world. But before that happened, Carter had to face a monumental task. He had not discovered a single artifact. He had discovered hundreds upon hundreds of objects. Each one needed to be documented, photographed, catalogued, removed, carefully preserved, studied. The excavation would take years. The tomb was not simply a room full of treasure. It was an enormous archaeological archive. Every object could tell a story. Every piece of furniture could reveal something about royal life. Every weapon could reveal something about warfare. Every piece of jewelry could reveal craftsmanship. Every inscription could reveal names, titles, religious beliefs, and political history. And the burial itself could tell researchers about how ancient Egyptians prepared their kings for eternity. The golden mask would eventually become the most famous object associated with Tutankhamun. But Carter's discovery contained far more than the mask. There were multiple coffins, shrines, chariots, thrones, beds, clothing, walking sticks, food containers, musical instruments, jewelry, statues, and countless other objects. The collection was so extensive that documenting everything required years of work. The world, however, did not want to wait. Newspapers wanted the story immediately. The discovery was too spectacular to remain a private archaeological matter. People wanted photographs. They wanted descriptions. They wanted to know what Tutankhamun had taken with him into the afterlife. And they wanted to know what happened when the tomb was opened. At first, the story was overwhelmingly positive. It was a triumph, an archaeological miracle. A forgotten king had been returned to history. But there was something else happening outside the tomb. The public was becoming fascinated by the idea of entering an ancient burial chamber that had been sealed for thousands of years. The imagery was irresistible. A forgotten pharaoh, a hidden tomb, a sealed doorway, gold, mummies, ancient gods, and a civilization surrounded by mystery. The discovery arrived at exactly the right moment for mass media. Newspapers had become enormously influential. Photography was becoming more common. People across Europe and America were fascinated by Egypt. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb became a worldwide sensation. But the story would soon take a darker turn, because only a few months after the tomb was opened, Lord Carnarvon would become seriously ill. At first, there was nothing supernatural about the illness. It began with something ordinary, an insect bite. Carnarvon had suffered a bite on his face. The wound became infected. His condition deteriorated. Doctors attempted to treat him, but the infection became increasingly serious. Eventually, Carnarvon developed severe complications. He was taken to Cairo for treatment, and while doctors fought to save him, newspapers began watching. The man who had helped finance the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was now dangerously ill. The timing was extraordinary. The tomb had only recently been opened. The world was already fascinated by ancient Egypt, and suddenly, one of the most important people connected with the discovery was dying. The facts were simple. A man had suffered an infection. He became seriously ill. He died. But history is rarely shaped by facts alone. It is shaped by the stories people tell about those facts. And journalists knew that the story of a wealthy English lord dying soon after entering an ancient Egyptian tomb would attract attention. The idea of a curse was already familiar to the public. Stories about dangerous mummies had existed long before Tutankhamun. 19th century literature had helped create images of ancient Egyptian revenge. The supernatural had already become part of popular culture. Now the discovery of a real royal tomb provided the perfect setting. The ingredients were all there. An ancient king, a sealed tomb, a mysterious civilization, a sudden illness, a famous death, and a public hungry for a mystery. But none of this meant that Tutankhamun had cursed Carnarvon. There was no scientific evidence for such a thing. There was no authenticated warning inside the tomb predicting his death. There was no ancient inscription declaring that anyone who entered would die. The curse was beginning outside the tomb. It was being created through interpretation, through headlines, through repetition, through imagination. And soon, the story would become bigger than the discovery itself. Carnarvon's condition continued to worsen. News spread quickly. People around the world waited for updates. The man who had stood beside Carter at the entrance to the tomb was now fighting for his life. Then, on the 5th of April, 1923, Lord Carnarvon died in Cairo. He was 56 years old. The news traveled rapidly, and almost immediately, the connection to Tutankhamun's tomb became irresistible. A man had entered the tomb. Months later, he was dead. For believers, that seemed like evidence. For skeptics, it was a tragic coincidence. For newspapers, it was a story. And the story was about to become a legend. Reports began appearing about the curse of the pharaoh. Some stories claimed that ancient forces had been awakened. Others suggested that the tomb itself had somehow brought death. The more the story was repeated, the more believable it became. And then came one of the most famous details of all. According to later accounts, the lights in Cairo supposedly went out at the moment Carnarvon died. The story became part of the mythology surrounding his death. But the blackout has never been established as evidence of anything supernatural. It was another detail added to an increasingly dramatic narrative. Other stories followed. Some connected Carnarvon's death to the ancient Egyptian religion. Others suggested that the tomb had contained a warning, but no such curse inscription was discovered in Tutankhamun's tomb. The tomb contained religious texts and protective imagery, as we would expect from an ancient Egyptian burial. But that is very different from a supernatural warning directed at modern archaeologists. The distinction matters. Ancient Egyptians certainly believed in supernatural forces. They believed in gods, spirits, magic, and the afterlife. They used protective spells and amulets. But the idea of a modern-style mummy's curse waiting to kill archaeologists was largely a product of modern imagination. Still, once the story had begun, it was difficult to stop. The world had discovered Tutankhamun, and now it believed it had discovered something else. A curse. The archaeological discovery had become a supernatural mystery, and the deaths that followed would be used to strengthen the story. Every new death connected, however loosely, to the excavation could become another piece of evidence. People who survived were less interesting. People who died were remembered. The pattern was beginning to form, and once people believed they saw a pattern, they started looking for more. Howard Carter would remain alive. He would continue working on the tomb for years. He would spend countless hours documenting the burial. He would become one of the most famous archaeologists in history. But even Carter could not escape the growing mythology. The tomb was no longer simply a place of archaeological discovery. It had become a symbol, a place where history and mystery collided, and the public wanted to believe that something ancient had awakened. The irony was that the real story was already extraordinary enough. A forgotten boy king, a tomb hidden for more than 3,000 years, an astonishing collection of objects, a brilliant but stubborn archaeologist, a wealthy patron who supported the search, and a civilization whose secrets were suddenly being revealed to the modern world. There was no need for a curse, but the curse made the story more dramatic. It gave the discovery a villain. It transformed coincidence into destiny, and it gave newspapers something even more powerful than gold: fear. The Valley of the Kings had kept Tutankhamun hidden for thousands of years. Now the world had found him. But instead of simply asking what the tomb could teach us about ancient Egypt, people began asking a darker question. Had Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon disturbed something that should have remained untouched? The question would echo for decades. It would inspire books, films, television programs, documentaries, stories told around campfires, and eventually countless versions of the same legend. But before we decide whether the curse was real, we have to examine what actually happened after the tomb was opened. Who died, who survived, and how many of the supposed victims had anything to do with Tutankhamun at all. Because once the complete story is examined, the curse begins to look very different. The tomb had been opened. Lord Carnarvon was dead, and the legend had begun. But the greatest mystery was still ahead. Not whether Tutankhamun had cursed the living, but how a single death could become one of the most famous supernatural stories in modern history. The period when rulers were still developing the symbols that would define pharaonic power for thousands of years: crowns, royal names, palaces, administrative systems, monumental burial, and perhaps human sacrifice. This gives the origins of Egyptian kingship a darker dimension. The state was being created. Power was becoming centralized. The king stood at the center, and death itself became a demonstration of hierarchy. When the ruler left the world, his household could follow. The end of sacrifice. Then the practice stopped. By the Second Dynasty, evidence for large-scale retainer sacrifice disappears. Why? We cannot know with certainty. Perhaps Egyptian religious ideas changed. Perhaps the economic cost was too high. A skilled servant was valuable. An administrator represented years of experience. Killing members of the royal household every time a king died was an expensive way to populate eternity. Perhaps symbolic substitutes became religiously sufficient. Models, statues, images, eventually Shaptis. Egyptian funerary culture became extraordinarily good at replacing reality with representation. Why kill a servant when magic could create one forever? Why place endless food inside a tomb when a carved offering formula could continually provide it? Why recreate an entire palace when miniature objects and images could serve the same purpose? This was one of ancient Egypt's great religious technologies. Representation could become reality, and once that principle was fully developed, the dead no longer required the living to die beside them. But the early graves remained, silent evidence of a time when the boundaries of royal power may have been far more absolute. Animals for the gods. Humans were not the only creatures transformed into mummies. Ancient Egypt produced animal mummies on an enormous scale. Cats, dogs, ibises, crocodiles, falcons, baboons, fish, snakes, and many other species. But animal mummification had several different purposes. Some animals were beloved companions. Pets could be buried with care. Others were sacred animals associated with particular gods. Still others were bred and mummified as votive offerings. Millions of animal mummies were produced across Egyptian history. The scale can be astonishing. Underground galleries contained enormous numbers of preserved animals. Pilgrims could purchase a mummified animal associated with a deity and dedicate it as an offering. Some bundles contain complete animals. Others contain only partial remains. Some contain little or no animal material at all. The ancient religious economy surrounding these offerings was complex. To modern observers, corridors filled with thousands of animal mummies can feel unsettling. But to ancient worshippers, these were objects of devotion, messages to the divine world, offerings preserved in physical form. Once again, death was not necessarily an ending. It could become a bridge, the opening of the mouth. Eventually, the mummy was ready. But one essential transformation remained. The dead body had been preserved. Now its senses had to be restored symbolically. The opening of the mouth ceremony was among the most important funerary rituals. A priest touched ritual instruments to the mouth and other parts of a statue or mummy. The purpose was restoration. The deceased needed to breathe, speak, see, hear, eat. The body had been silent. Ritual returned its abilities. Imagine the scene at the entrance to the tomb. The mummy stands or lies within its coffin. Priests gather. Incense rises. Family members mourn. Sacred words are spoken. Objects touch the face. The dead king is being awakened, not to return to Egypt, but to enter another existence. Then the burial procession moves deeper into the tomb. into darkness. The sealed door. The treasures are inside. Food is inside. Clothing is inside. Weapons, furniture, amulets, statues, funerary texts. The mummy rests within its coffins. The burial chamber becomes an eternal palace. Then the workers leave. Doors are closed. Passages may be blocked. Seals are placed. The living return to sunlight. The king remains behind. Silence settles over the tomb, perhaps for days, perhaps months, perhaps years. Then someone comes back. Not a priest, not a grieving relative, a thief, the enemies of eternity. Every valuable object placed inside a tomb created temptation. Gold, silver, copper, fine linen, oils, furniture, precious stones. Even the coffins themselves could be valuable. The Egyptians knew this. Tomb builders understood security. Entrances were concealed. Passages were blocked. Heavy stones were used. Burial chambers were hidden deep underground. But no security system survives forever when generations of people know treasure is inside. Workers knew the valleys. Officials possessed records. Priests knew burial locations. Guards could be bribed. Political instability weakened enforcement. And eventually, thieves entered. Royal tomb robbery became particularly severe during the later New Kingdom. Surviving papyri, record investigations. Suspects were questioned. Officials inspected tombs. Testimony was recorded. The bureaucratic language is almost painfully calm. But what investigators were describing was sacrilege. Kings had been disturbed, coffins opened, bodies damaged, gold stripped away. The eternal houses of the pharaohs were being dismantled for profit. For priests responsible for the royal dead, the situation became desperate. They faced an impossible choice. Leave the kings inside their tombs, and thieves might destroy them. Or remove the kings themselves, break the seals, open the coffins, touch the sacred bodies, move them somewhere safer. And that is exactly what happened. The night the pharaohs moved, imagine a group of priests entering a royal tomb, perhaps carrying lambs. They know who lies inside. A king whose name had once commanded Egypt. They open the burial. The mummy is removed. Perhaps damage is repaired. Perhaps valuable materials have already disappeared. The body is rewrapped. Labels may identify the dead. Then the pharaoh is carried away. Not in a grand state procession, not surrounded by soldiers, not beneath the sun, but secretly through darkness. A king fleeing his own tomb, centuries after death, and he was not alone. Other royal bodies were moved again, and sometimes again, eventually. Several of Egypt's greatest rulers ended up together, hidden away. Their original burial places abandoned or robbed, their bodies surviving because ancient priests violated the very tombs they were trying to protect. Centuries passed. Knowledge of the hiding places disappeared. The priests died. Dynasties collapsed. Temples closed. Languages changed. Egypt became part of other empires. The names written on the coffins became unreadable to most people, and the royal dead slept together, hidden, waiting until the 19th century, when people entered one of those secret places again and discovered something almost impossible. a room filled with pharaohs, kings who had been missing for thousands of years, not lying inside their magnificent original tombs, but gathered together in hiding. The discovery would become known as the Royal Cache, and inside were rulers whose names belonged to the greatest age of ancient Egypt. Their bodies had survived thieves, political collapse, religious change, and more than 3,000 years of darkness. But their survival created another mystery. Why exactly had each king been moved? How many times? Who had opened their coffins? Which burial objects originally belonged to them? And perhaps most importantly, what other royal bodies were still missing? Because the cache returned some of Egypt's greatest pharaohs to history, but not all of them. Somewhere beneath the cliffs and valleys of Egypt, kings and queens remain unaccounted for. Tombs remain undiscovered. Bodies remain unidentified. And one of the most famous women in the ancient world is still missing. The Egyptians built monuments to make death visible, but sometimes the safest place for a pharaoh was somewhere no one could find him. The darkness remains. The desert remembers differently than we do. Human beings remember through stories, through names, through faces, through words passed from one generation to another. The desert remembers through silence. It covers footsteps. It fills abandoned rooms. It buries broken statues. It closes entrances. And slowly, it hides entire lives. For thousands of years, the pharaohs fought against that silence. They carved their names into stone because they feared being forgotten. They raised pyramids because ordinary graves were not enough. They filled tombs with everything they believed eternity might require. They preserved their bodies because they believed identity could survive death. They built temples where priests could continue speaking their names long after their voices had disappeared. They wanted permanence. But nothing remained permanent. Dynasties collapsed. Temples were abandoned. Royal names were erased. Tombs were robbed. Golden objects were melted down. Statues were broken. Mummies were moved. Cities disappeared beneath sand. And eventually, even the language carved across Egypt's monuments fell silent. For centuries, no living person could fully understand the hieroglyphs left behind. The pharaohs had achieved something close to eternity, but humanity had forgotten how to read their words. Then the silence began to break. A tomb opened. A name was deciphered. A broken inscription was reconstructed. A mummy entered a laboratory. A CT scanner revealed an ancient wound. Fragments of forgotten temples emerged from later walls. Cities appeared beneath the desert, and rulers deliberately removed from history returned. Hatshepsut returned. Akhenaten returned. Tutankhamun returned. Ramesses III's body revealed evidence connected to a conspiracy recorded thousands of years earlier. Seqenenretau's damaged skull preserved the violence of an age when Egypt itself was divided. The dead began telling their stories again, not through ghosts, not through curses, through evidence. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of ancient Egypt. Not that the pharaohs possessed supernatural powers, but that, after 3,000 years, so much of them remains. Their fingerprints survive on objects. Their faces survive in stone. Their illnesses survive in bone. Their political struggles survive in damaged inscriptions. Even attempts to destroy them have survived as evidence. A missing cartouche tells us someone wanted a name forgotten. A smashed statue tells us memory became dangerous. A hidden mummy tells us someone feared tomb robbers. An unfinished burial tells us death arrived before preparation was complete. The absence itself becomes part of the story, and still there are empty spaces. Nefertiti's burial remains uncertain. Some royal tombs remain undiscovered. Some mummies remain unidentified. Some reigns survive only through fragments. Some deaths may never be explained. Some chambers may still lie beyond walls. No modern person has entered. And somewhere, beneath Egypt's enormous archaeological landscape, discoveries are almost certainly still waiting. Perhaps they will answer questions we have asked for generations. Perhaps they will overturn explanations we currently accept. Or perhaps they will create entirely new mysteries. That is the nature of archaeology. Every opened door reveals another corridor. Every answer changes the question. The pharaohs tried to control how eternity would remember them. They showed themselves victorious, powerful, chosen by the gods, guardians of order. But archaeology has given us something their monuments rarely intended to show: their humanity. They became frightened. They became sick. They fought over succession. They made political mistakes. They challenged traditions. They betrayed one another. They loved. They mourned. They aged. And eventually, even the rulers called divine faced the same darkness, waiting for everyone. Death. Perhaps that is why we continue returning to ancient Egypt. The gold attracts us. The pyramids astonish us. The mummies disturb and fascinate us. The mysteries keep us searching. But beneath all of it is something familiar. Human beings confronting the knowledge that their lives will end, and desperately trying to leave something behind. A name, a monument, a face, a story, something that says, I was here. Remember me. Thousands of years later, we do. Tonight, we walked through the darker corridors of pharaonic Egypt. We entered palaces where conspiracy reached the throne. We examined kings whose bodies preserved evidence of violent death. We followed rulers whose names were deliberately attacked. We watched embalmers prepare the dead for eternity. We stood beside the graves of people who may have followed Egypt's earliest kings into death. And we followed royal mummies as priests secretly carried them away from tombs that could no longer protect them. But the story is unfinished. The desert is still there. The valleys are still there. The sealed spaces are still there. And beneath millions of tons of stone and sand, ancient Egypt continues to keep secrets. Perhaps somewhere there is still a queen waiting to be identified. Perhaps another forgotten king lies behind a sealed doorway. Perhaps an inscription exists that will finally explain a mysterious succession. Perhaps the answer to a question historians have debated for a century is already sitting unnoticed inside a museum storeroom. We simply have not recognized it yet. The pharaohs wanted eternity. In a strange way, they received it, not because their bodies lived forever, not because their kingdoms survived unchanged, and not because their monuments defeated time. They received eternity because thousands of years later, we are still searching for them, still speaking their names, still studying their faces, still entering their tombs, still asking what happened and still wondering what remains hidden in the darkness. The golden masks may shine beneath museum lights now, but behind them are stories that belong to the night. Stories of ambition, power, faith, violence, fear, death, and the impossible human dream of being remembered forever. The pharaohs are gone. Their world is gone, but their mysteries are not. And somewhere beneath the Egyptian night, the desert is still keeping its secrets. The door had been opened. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb was not the beginning of the curse. At least, not yet. At the moment Howard Carter first looked through that small opening in the ancient doorway, there was no supernatural warning. There was no mysterious voice from the darkness. No ancient inscription announcing death. No invisible force waiting to escape. There was only a room filled with objects that had been hidden from the modern world for thousands of years. The greatest archaeological discovery of its generation had been made. A forgotten king had returned to history. But history does not always remain simple. The moment the tomb was opened, the discovery became more than archaeology. It became a story. And stories have a strange power. They can take a real event and transform it into something larger than the facts themselves. Tutankhamun's tomb contained gold. It contained ancient symbols. It contained a mummy. It contained a mysterious civilization that modern audiences already associated with gods, death, magic, and the afterlife. And then, only months after the discovery, Lord Carnarvon died. To a historian, this was a tragic medical event. To a newspaper editor, it was an extraordinary coincidence. To a frightened public, it could become something else entirely. A warning. The timing seemed almost perfect for a supernatural story. For more than 3,000 years, the tomb had remained hidden. Then archaeologists opened it, and one of the men responsible for the discovery died. The connection was difficult for people to ignore, but coincidence is not proof. A person can become seriously ill after visiting a tomb, without the tomb being responsible. A person can die after an archaeological discovery, without the discovery causing the death. And a pattern can appear meaningful even when the events within it are unrelated. That distinction would become increasingly important, because once the idea of a curse entered the public imagination, people began looking backward and forward at the same time. They looked backward for ancient warnings. They searched the tomb for evidence. They searched Egyptian religion for stories of punishment. And they looked forward, waiting to see who would die next. Every death connected to the excavation could now become part of the legend. Every illness could become suspicious. Every coincidence could become evidence. But every survivor was far less interesting. The people who continued living ordinary lives did not make dramatic headlines. They did not create mystery. They did not sell newspapers. The curse story, therefore, developed a powerful imbalance. Deaths were remembered. Survivals were forgotten. And the longer the story continued, the more convincing the pattern could appear. Yet there was another reason the curse was so attractive. The idea was not entirely new. Long before Tutankhamun's tomb was discovered, Western popular culture had already developed an obsession with mummies. Ancient Egypt had become associated with hidden tombs, mysterious rituals, forgotten gods, and the supernatural. Stories of mummies returning from the dead had appeared in literature. The idea of ancient revenge had already existed in the imagination of readers and audiences. Tutankhamun arrived at precisely the right moment. The real tomb provided the setting. The real mummy provided the central character. Carnarvon's real death provided the tragedy, and the newspapers provided the storyteller. Together, they created something that was far more powerful than any single piece of evidence. They created a legend. But there is something important we must remember. The ancient Egyptians themselves did not think of their tombs in the same way modern horror stories portray them. A royal tomb was not simply a place where a dead king waited to punish intruders. It was a sacred environment. It was part of a complex religious system designed to protect the deceased and help the king enter the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that words had power, images had power, names had power, rituals had power. Protective objects were placed with the dead because the afterlife was believed to contain dangers. But this does not mean the Egyptians created the modern idea of a mummy's curse. The popular image of an ancient pharaoh waiting thousands of years to kill an archaeologist is largely a modern construction. And this is where the story becomes even more fascinating. Because the real mystery is not whether Tutankhamun's spirit escaped from the tomb. The real mystery is why modern society wanted to believe that it did. Perhaps the answer lies in our relationship with death. The tomb reminded people that human beings have always feared being forgotten. Tutankhamun had been forgotten for thousands of years. His name had nearly disappeared. Then, suddenly, he became famous again. Millions of people who had never heard of him learned his name. They saw his golden mask. They saw images of his tomb. They heard stories about his mysterious death. And eventually, they heard about the curse. The forgotten king had become immortal in another way, not through ancient Egyptian rituals, but through modern storytelling. Today, more than a century after Carter opened the tomb, the story still survives. People still ask whether the curse was real. They still repeat stories about Carnarvon. They still search for mysterious deaths. They still wonder whether ancient tombs contain hidden dangers. And every generation adds something new to the legend. But perhaps the most remarkable fact is much simpler. The tomb itself survived. The objects survived. The inscriptions survived. And many of the people who entered the tomb survived too. Howard Carter continued his work for many years. He did not die immediately. He did not mysteriously disappear. He continued documenting the tomb and its contents. He lived until 1939. His life after the discovery was not the story of a man slowly destroyed by an ancient curse. It was the story of an archaeologist who spent years dealing with the enormous responsibility of his discovery. That reality is less frightening, but it is far more interesting, because the true story of Tutankhamun does not need supernatural forces to be extraordinary. A child became king. A religious revolution transformed Egypt. A young ruler died unexpectedly. His burial was hidden. His name disappeared. His tomb survived. A determined archaeologist searched for it, and after thousands of years, the doorway was opened. That alone is astonishing. But the story was only beginning. Lord Carnarvon's death would become the first major chapter in the legend. Soon, newspapers would begin connecting other deaths to the tomb. The supposed list of victims would grow. The public would become fascinated. Scientists would eventually investigate possible explanations, and Hollywood would transform the mummy's curse into one of the most recognizable horror concepts in popular culture. The question would no longer be simply what happened inside Tutankhamun's tomb. It would become something much larger. Could an ancient curse really survive for 3,000 years? Could something buried with a dead king harm the living? Or had the world created a monster that never existed? The answers would be buried beneath layers of fact, coincidence, exaggeration, journalism, popular culture, and human imagination. And to uncover the truth, we must go back to the spring of 1923. Lord Carnarvon was seriously ill. The newspapers were watching. The world was waiting. And the story of the curse was about to become impossible to stop. The tomb had been opened. The treasures had been revealed. But now, death had entered the story. And the world was ready to believe that it had come from inside the tomb. Thank you for spending this journey with Xity Night History. If you enjoy exploring the forgotten mysteries, lost civilizations, and hidden stories of the ancient world, subscribe to the channel and join us for our next journey into history. Until then, let the lights grow dim. Let the ancient world return to silence. And remember, some stories are buried, but they are never truly gone.